Party. Minister Miller,
let loose.
I wanted to know if you can share some words about Murray Sinclair and how you worked with him and maybe a memory from him.
Yeah, I mean, Murray had become a friend in the last couple of years to me, so he'll be really missed. My deepest condolences to Nigan and family. I don't think his contributions to Canada are now fully appreciated, or really it's registered in people's mind how important man Murray was. Even in his retirement, he, in a very, very difficult circumstance, was asked by Patty Haidu and I to come in and help mediate what is now the largest legal settlement in Canadian history and one of the largest in North American history, in a very painful area, compensation to Indigenous children in the welfare system. And he did it deftly in really difficult circumstances with, emotions really raw, sides being drawn, people not talking to each other, and was able to bring a lot of people together outside a court process, 3 or 4 court cases that were overlapping, different, weaponized political atmosphere around the topic of Indigenous children in the welfare system, and it consumed a large chunk of even some of our electoral cycles. And he was able to really negotiate that really deftly. I called him up once in a while, and usually on a Saturday or a Sunday morning, to talk about something that was on my mind. And there was one particular Saturday morning where I called him up and he answered. And he said, "Oh, Marc Miller, I've been cursing your name for the last week." And I was like, "Oh, what about?" And he said, about this settlement, where a lot of characters involved, a lot of people that are passionate about the issue. So he was in the middle of it, trying to do his best at a rather advanced age with his health fragile. And he's both having cursing your name all week for dragging you into this, you and Patty. And so I answered to him. I was like, "Murray, when I got in, when I became the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, I reached out and we talked. And I remember someone telling me that it was really important to sit down with people and listening to them talk to them outside the court. And he's like, "Who the hell told you that?" And so he knew it was him. And if I'd reminded him it was him, he probably would have hung up on me. But he's a warm character, and he didn't have to reach out to a younger minister like me and help me out, and he did. And I'm forever grateful personally for him, and just wish his family well.
When you talk about legacy, what do you think his is?
Well, first, as he's the author of the TRC. Offered some very important, very basic thoughts about communicating with each other. A report that's work is still largely incomplete, that will take generations to complete. I think just as a human being and someone who was willing to reach out despite the circumstances that Indigenous peoples are in right now, to the other side and talk first about human relations. And I think I'll just remember him as a very warm guy who didn't need to reach out to someone that was 2 decades younger than him and help him out. So.
Monsieur Miller, est-ce que je peux vous poser une question en français sur votre dossier principal, l'immigration?
Oui.
Avez-vous l'impression que votre job va se complexifier à partir de demain, surtout si Donald Trump est élu?
Mais d'abord, il faut regarder les résultats. Comme Canadiens, avec notre partenaire principal, les États-Unis, on est toujours prêt à tout. On est surpréparé, évidemment. Vous avez vu le travail qu'on a pu faire dans la renégociation de l'ALENA avec le président qui était là. S'il y a une chose dont nos partenaires américains nous accusent, c'est justement d'être surpréparés. Parce que, justement, c'est notre relation la plus importante. En ce qui a trait à la frontière, évidemment, c'est dans l'intérêt des 2 pays de s'assurer que cette frontière soit une qui est très bien gérée, notamment au niveau des flux économiques, mais aussi au niveau de la sécurité, ce qui est notre préoccupation principale. Alors, j'ai pas de raison à croire que ça va changer du jour au lendemain. Évidemment, je suis très au courant de la rhétorique politique qui s'est jouée durant ces élections. Il reste encore une journée, puis de toute façon, peu importe qui gagne, on va être préparé.
Est-ce que vous avez l'impression que si Donald Trump est élu et qu'il va de l'avant vers la déportation massive des sans-papiers, le Canada pourrait se retrouver dans une situation où il devrait gérer ce flux migratoire-là, et ce serait donc encore plus complexe pour le Canada de gérer comme il faut et de façon sécuritaire cette frontière?
On est toujours prêt à tout. évidemment, il faut se préparer à toutes les éventualités. C'est quelque chose qu'on fait. Je ne le discute pas sur la place publique avec 24 heures à faire. Mais reste que, comme j'ai dit, c'est dans l'intérêt des deux pays d'être préparés et d'avoir une frontière qui est sécuritaire. Ils ont des préoccupations vis-à-vis de notre gestion. Évidemment, l'inverse est vrai aussi. Mais ce qu'on a pu démontrer, c'est qu'on est préparé à tout.
Est-ce que je peux vous demander en français des commentaires sur M. Sinclair?
Oui, ben c'était un ami. Murray, je l'ai compté comme un ami. Il m'a aidé en tant que jeune ministre dans des dossiers très épineux, très difficiles avec les peuples autochtones. Il y a un moment où je l'ai appelé un samedi matin pendant qu'on avait engagé, Pali et moi, pour négocier le règlement le plus important de l'histoire du Canada, plusieurs milliards de dollars pour des enfants autochtones qui ont été pris dans le système de jeunesse, à leur insu souvent. Et il a pu négocier pendant des semaines et des mois avec notre département, avec le Caring Society, l'APN. Je l'ai appelé comme ça à tout bout de champ, sur un autre enjeu, en fait, puis il m'a dit j'étais en train de jurer ton nom pendant des jours parce que tu m'as traîné dans ce dossier-là comme joke, comme blague. Ouais. J'ai dit, à un moment donné, Murray, il y a quelqu'un qui m'a dit qu'il faut s'asseoir avec les Autochtones, il faut leur parler, il faut privilégier le dialogue. Peu importe le résultat, ils disent « Qui t'a dit ça? » Je savais très bien que c'était lui. Mais on avait cette amitié, c'est quelque chose que j'ai beaucoup prisé. Et puis ce que je vais me souvenir de lui, c'est que c'est quelqu'un qui a pris une chance sur quelqu'un comme moi, qui est de plusieurs décennies plus jeune que lui. Puis je le comptais comme un ami. Alors c'est une peine très personnelle, mais je souhaite toutes mes condoléances à sa famille, Megan et autres, pendant cette période immensément difficile. Merci. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Here to express my deepest condolences on the loss of Senator Sinclair, Murray Sinclair. He was a Canadian icon, someone who really gave us a blueprint for reconciliation in Canada. He was an incredible lawyer, jurist, chief commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as a senator. And he was a distinguished individual in every sense of the way, someone who is truly humble. And as the Minister of Crown and Indigenous Relations, I want to express my profound condolences to his family and to all Indigenous people as well as Canadians. He really did set a bar for all of us to follow, and I've had many encounters with him over the years, many conversations, and the latest one was several months ago where he was advocating for his client. He was an inspiration to all of us, and he will be truly missed on the national stage, but make no mistake, he has certainly left us in a better place than he found it, and we're very grateful for all that he has done. Le juge Sinclair a démontré tout au long de sa vie qu'il était un homme d'intégrité extraordinaire. Le Canada lui doit beaucoup. Sa gentillesse et son courage ont contribué à façonner notre conception de la réconciliation et de la guérison nécessaire pour aller de l'avant ensemble. Sa mémoire est consacrée aux sagesses et d'impact durable. Il nous rappelle le travail qu'il reste à accomplir et l'importance de le faire avec honnêteté, humilité et détermination. Merci.
Can I ask both of you if it's okay with both of you together to reflect on passing of Senator Sinclair, if that'd be all right?
Absolutely. Want to start? Should we start?
Go ahead.
Well, I think the First Nations across Canada lost a leader. It's a huge loss for First Nations in this country. I'll remember Murray for his wisdom, his courage, his sense of humor. I was fortunate enough to be able to, when I was elected, be able to co-chair meetings with him when we chaired meetings between Indigenous senators and Indigenous parliamentarians. We stayed in touch during COVID, really trying to deliver a message of unity on behalf of Indigenous peoples in Canada. As a treaty education lead before I was a parliamentarian, I don't think there was a single person I quoted more than Senator Sinclair during his time of Truth and Reconciliation. You know, his quote on education is what got us here, and education is what will get us out of this mess, is something that I always remember. I always remember, you know, when he said that, you know, while Indigenous children were being mistreated at residential schools, being called pagans, being said they were uncivilized, you know, that same message was being delivered by the education systems of this country. And he was such a role model for so many academics, for so many leaders, for so many people who learned from his words, quoted him, and he will be sadly missed.
Yeah, I got to know Murray a little bit in the late 80s in Winnipeg, when he was one of the justices in the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, looking into the relations between Aboriginal people of Winnipeg and the Winnipeg Police Service. And he did, it was really a political awakening for me. Murray Sinclair did an incisively brilliant job in identifying the racism that existed in the City of Winnipeg Police at that time in '88, and city government generally, failure to recognize that reality. And he was articulate. He was brilliant in the work that he did. He went on to do many other things, including co-commissioner of the Aboriginal Commission on Truth and Reconciliation. He did tremendous work there on the wider effects of racism and colonization in Canada. Was an incredible senator. It was great to be able to walk down the street and have coffee with him, or sit on a plane back and forth from Winnipeg. I'm incredibly sad today, and I and Canada are really going to miss him.
And I can't help but think that while Dan is talking about all of the things he's done, I don't think there's a single Indigenous person in Canada who can say has led the charge for reconciliation more than Murray Sinclair, and just the things that he was able to achieve, the things that people listened to him when he talked. You know, he's one of the people up there that you can honestly say the reconciliation in Canada wouldn't be where it is without him.
C'est possible, M. Vandal, d'avoir ces commentaires-là en français. Donc, vous dites, vous avez travaillé avec lui quand vous étiez tous les deux à Winnipeg. Qu'est-ce qui vous a marqué de...
La première fois que j'ai reconnu Murray Sinclair, c'était en 88, quand il était président de Aboriginal Justice Inquiry au Manitoba, à Winnipeg, qui a regardé avec les inégalités, le racisme dans la force de police de Winnipeg et leur interaction avec les peuples autochtones de Winnipeg. Et vraiment, il a fait un job extraordinaire. Il a mis de la lumière sur le racisme qui était apparent à Winnipeg dans le temps. De là, il était commissaire sur la commissariat sur la vérité et la commission de la vérité. Et puis, il a fait encore un job extraordinaire. Puis, c'est vraiment un homme qui a mis sa marque en défendant, puis en défendant les perspectives des Autochtones. Thank you.
If you have any thoughts, and if not, that's fine too, but it's like, I assume yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, our hearts go out to his family, to everyone in his community, everyone he's touched over his incredible career. I mean, you can't say enough wonderful things about Senator Sinclair. Definitely leaving a big hole in the advocacy work, and hopefully we'll live up to the legacy that he deserves. Thank you. Out of breath, but sorry.
Bonjour. Selon le Parti vert du Canada, nous sommes bien sûr inquiets avec le témoignage de Mme Freeland et M. Wilkinson ce matin devant le Comité sur les ressources naturelles. So Mike Morris and I are here to both respond to what both ministers said and didn't say about the TMX pipeline expansion, now owned by the people of Canada, what they claimed about the economic benefits, and of course, the very recent announcement of emissions caps. So we'll just take turns and go quickly and take your questions. What happened today before the committee was very disappointing in what didn't get talked about, which is the elephant in the room, which is that we know from every international body that looks at climate science that not a single additional penny should be put into fossil fuel infrastructure. That's been the advice from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the International Monetary Fund, Secretary General of the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Energy Agency for a very long time now. So since we were told not to put another penny into fossil fuel infrastructure, this government put $34 billion into the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. We have never had an economic analysis on costs and benefits before the decision was made that the people of Canada should both buy the pipeline from Kinder Morgan and complete its construction. It represents blowing a hole, a gigantic hole, through our legal commitments under the Paris Agreement, and it means that anything said about how we're going to get our money back out of it is both questionable in terms of getting our money back, but the larger issue is what it costs future generations that the Liberals lied to us on this fundamental point that they cared about climate. The emissions cap, I have to say the draft was completely inadequate, and we will study the final announcement that was made just moments ago and see if it can possibly meet the requirements of our legally binding commitments under Paris.
Turn to questions.
Yeah, okay. Any questions? En français, anglais.
Ms. May, you're a party leader, you've received security clearance. Yesterday, in response to the protests in Brampton and the violence that clashed there, Liberal MP Chandra Arya said that quote-unquote Khalistani extremists have infiltrated the Canadian political apparatus and law enforcement agencies, and that they get a free pass in Canada. What do you make of that statement?
I was also taken with the comments of Harjit Sajjan, the former Premier of British Columbia, who himself has been the target of extremist violence. As you remember, he was beaten and in hospital. We welcome, and as the Greens, we are strongly in favor of immigration to Canada, of welcoming people from all corners of the world. But it is important that diaspora communities leave their domestic political grievances in their home country and don't bring them to Canada. It was very concerning to see violence take place in a Hindu temple. We know the visit from the Indian government representatives here was likely to spark additional conflict. I know that the security agencies are very concerned about this, and I think it's obviously something we deplore. But Khalistani extremism, like any sectarian extremism that's brought into Canada, is something the Green Party opposes.
But what about specifically the comments that Chandra Arya made to say that this is something that has infiltrated Canadian institutions like law enforcement?
I would not be able to say it's influenced law enforcement. I think it requires further investigation. I do think Harjit Sajjan's statement is correct, that we've been too willing to accept the notion that accepting the full diaspora from any other country means we turn a blind eye to where, for instance, the single largest act of terrorism on Canadian soil remains to this day, the destruction of the Air India flight by terrorist activities from Khalistani elements in Canada that killed almost 300 Canadian citizens. That remains a stain on all Canadians, that we have permitted extremism to exist, whether one could use the terms to turn a blind eye to them. I wouldn't use that. I think we need to have law enforcement, Canadian communities on side, on board, and protecting each other from violence and extremism from any source.
L'élection américaine demain, selon vous, qu'est-ce qui est en jeu pour le Canada demain?
Oui, c'est une question ce n'est pas seulement pour le Canada, c'est une question pour tout le monde, vraiment le monde, la planète. Parce que M. Trump, je préfère toujours de rester dehors des politiques de notre pays. Grâce à Dieu, c'est un autre pays, mais malheureusement, nous sommes dans la même planète. Et la décision d'un président des États-Unis a l'implication pour tout le monde et pour la planète. Et j'espère que M. Trump, qui a pour toute son carrière, représente quelqu'un en faveur d'énergie fossile. Il est quelqu'un qui est aussi proche avec les autres, qu'est-ce que c'est le mot propre en français, mais les bully boys comme Poutine et Netanyahu et Trump, ils sont ensemble avec les mêmes positions contre les choses qui sont absolument nécessaires pour protéger la planète contre la crise climatique, et en même temps, ils sont contre la vraie démocratie. C'est une menace pour tout le monde et aussi pour le Canada.
The Liberals have said the final regulations for the emissions cap won't come till next year. Do you think the government will survive long enough to actually implement this policy?
If this government survives to implement any climate action, I'll be astonished, because there's never been any indication that they actually understand what's necessary for climate action.
Are you concerned that the government could hit a supply crisis if the current filibuster extends into the Christmas break?
Not really. I think that there's a very strong likelihood that the majority of individual members of Parliament and the larger parties will see a benefit in making sure we don't have a crisis on the continuity of supply for government business, that we don't, I think, going into a premature election before we have a report on foreign interference. Back to the first question Mark was asking, we need to get to the bottom of a lot of questions about foreign interference before we go into the next election. And there are key pieces of legislation that we're waiting for, some relating to Indigenous rights and the modern-day treaties. Their legislation is waiting, and C-77 just came out. My constituents want to see C-33 passed, which will have protections for Salish Sea from anchorages, banning the export of thermal coal. We have a lot of important work that's been going on here. It doesn't get much attention, the important work, but we'd like to get it through before it dies on the order paper before an election.
Murray Sinclair caps that were announced today by the
I have to say I need to study them. The drafts were so poor. As we know, the final regulations aren't promised for some considerable time. And when you spend $34,000 million, which is $34 billion, on building a pipeline whose sole purpose is to expand and prolong the life of some of the most polluting fossil fuels on the planet from the oil sands, then at that point, your emissions caps have to actually be much, much tougher than anything the current government has contemplated, just to make up for what you've done in the emissions target from building a pipeline.
What we did see on the emissions cap between when the Prime Minister first promised an emissions cap, not a production cap, back in 2021, is the longer it took, the more time that the oil and gas industry had to water down what had been promised in that cap. And so we'll be looking to see more with respect to the stringency of the cap and whether some of those significant loopholes that we saw introduced in the draft version earlier this year, whether they either continued or, worse yet, with more influence from the oil and gas industry, potentially got worse still.
À propos de Murray Sinclair et son décès, j'aimerais avoir, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, c'est un grand honneur pour moi que j'ai travaillé avec lui et je le connais bien. Il est quelqu'un incroyable, il est une inspiration et je suis tellement triste avec la réalité que maintenant il est mort. I'm friends with his family. I've admired him at a distance for years. Becoming his friend was an enormous honor. We worked together, which people may, he's best known, of course, as chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Il est quelqu'un qui a fait les choses en faveur des droits des Autochtones et particulièrement pour la justice pour les enfants autochtones dans le système horrifique des écoles résidentielles. Mais aussi, il a fait les choses en faveur de notre planète. He was the sponsor in the Senate who brought a private member's bill that I was also a sponsor in the House to ban the keeping of whales in captivity. He represented Indigenous people's interests. He represented Mother Earth's interest. He is an extraordinary human being of great intellectual strength, moral conviction, and he was spiritually rooted in a way that meant anyone who met him knew that you were in the presence of someone extraordinary, an extraordinary human being who contributed an outsized impact in his lifetime for the planet and for all Canadians and for justice for Indigenous children.
Vous avez l'air vraiment touché et ému.
Ouais. Oui, je l'aime. Et encore, je l'aime. C'est vrai qu'il est mort, je peux utiliser le temps sont passé, mais c'est trop tôt.
If I can offer Elizabeth maybe just a final comment. You heard Elizabeth speak about the work that Greens are doing. I thought could just underscore that both Elizabeth and I as Greens are here to continue to work for folks in our communities. That means that today, after question period, we'll be looking to propose 10 amendments to Bill C-61, looking to strengthen legislation to ensure this government follows through on commitments made to First Nations communities across the country to do better when it comes to delivering clean drinking water for the tap. As an example, 6 nations of the Grand River continues to have 70% of folks in their community living without clean drinking water from the tap. We've got 10 amendments to that bill that we have heard from Indigenous leaders and are bringing that forward to that legislation. We're also continuing to push to see significant measures introduced in the fall economic statement, whether that relates to housing and having HST waived for Habitat for Humanity, for example, or our continued calls to see the Canada Disability Benefit fixed and actually ending legislated poverty for hundreds of thousands of folks living with disabilities across the country. And of course, when it comes to climate, calling for the kind of climate action that Elizabeth has been calling for her entire time here as a parliamentarian, for this government to recognize the urgency of the crisis that we are in. Every single day here as Greens, we're going to continue to do that work for as long as this session of Parliament lasts.
I see that Mr. Singh is waiting, but
Merci.
Thank you. Merci.
Merci.
Would you have a comment about what's happening in the United States and what's at stake for Canada in the next election?
I think there's always a lot at stake when there's an election, especially this one. I know I'm an MP from Cape Breton in northeastern Nova Scotia, and we're all watching, as everyone else is around the world, on who's going to win and what direction the United States goes, because it's important to Canada. So I think there's a collective anxiety and a collective sense of optimism. No one knows how it's going to go. It seems like all the pollsters say it's neck and neck, and it's going to depend, as most American elections do, on 6 states. So we'll wait and see, but I'll be watching with anticipation as everyone else.
What's at stake? The economy, the democracy? What's at stake there?
From my personal point of view, is that there is a lot at stake. Democracy, democratic institutions, how we treat people in general, how we treat people not as we live in a society right now, and it's started to form in Canada, where you look at your competitor and you try to bring them down to the lowest common denominator and treat the people and use words like evil or wacko or things like that. That terminology didn't happen by accident, and so there are certain places where it's been a hotbed, and we've seen it over the last 8 years in American politics, and we've seen it in the last 2 years in Canadian politics.
There's election in the United States tomorrow. What's at stake for Canada?
Well, I think it will be important to see the American public come out and vote for their next president. I'm watching, like everybody else is around the world, to see what happens. It's an important part of our democracy to hear from our community members and citizens, and I know the Americans will be doing that tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. So what's at stake for Canada?
Well, I think for Canada, in my perspective, it's important on continue to have a strong relationship with the United States. They're a very important trading partner for us, and a good neighbor and friend. And I look forward to working with my colleagues across the border and strengthening our relationship between our two great nations.
Despite protectionism and tariffs.
Hindu-Sikh fight in Brampton, I think, on the weekend. I don't want to characterize it because I may be mischaracterizing, but somebody hit somebody.
Well, we need to condemn all violence towards our ethnoculture and faith communities. I know there's tensions amongst community members from what's happened from the Indian government targeting a Canadian citizen here in Canada.
and with what the RCMP said, but I think Canadians need to respect each other, and members of our community got to peacefully protest, but we need to refrain from any violence that may occur, and I just hope the authorities take actions necessary to prevent any violence occurring and any actions that may threaten one's ability to go to their place of worship.
Your colleague Chandra Arya said that Khalistani extremists have a free pass in Canada, and he said that they've infiltrated the Canadian political apparatus and law enforcement agencies. Do you think that's appropriate to say publicly?
I'm not aware of what any one of my colleagues in the House of Commons has said. I have trust in the Canadian police services at all levels, and I know they're doing their best to make sure that Canadians are kept safe and remain safe in Canada.
Thanks for stopping.
Merci, George.
Merci.
Bonjour, ça va bien? Salut, bonjour. Oui, ça va bien. Je voulais juste prendre un petit moment parce qu'aujourd'hui, je vais répondre aux questions en chambre dans la période leader sur la question du logement. Puis, je pensais important de venir vous dire à quel point, pour le Québec, pour avoir parlé à plusieurs personnes, notamment des programmes, des projets qu'on a présentés, qu'on a annoncés, qu'il y a quand même une grande inquiétude sur la proposition des conservateurs sur le logement, puis l'accélérateur de logement. Et je pense que les gens comprennent mal comment ça fonctionne. Puis actuellement, l'accélérateur du logement, comme vous le savez, c'est une entente qu'on a prise avec Québec. C'est 900 millions que Québec a à côté. On a d'ailleurs annoncé plusieurs projets au Québec en lien avec cet accélérateur. Puis l'inquiétude qu'on a, c'est est-ce qu'une proposition comme celle de Poliev, en fait, est une proposition complètement irréfléchie, qui est en fait une proposition de coupure sur des logements. En fait, on va donner accès à la propriété sur le dos des plus vulnérables, qui sont en fait les gens qui attendent ces logements abordables et sociaux. Est-ce que vous avez des questions?
L'élection américaine, pour vous, qu'est-ce qui est en jeu demain?
Bien, c'est sûr que comme Canadiens, on n'est pas là pour commenter sur comment les Américains vont choisir leur futur président. Nous, on a, comme tu le sais, déjà travaillé avec l'administration Trump, on a travaillé avec l'administration Biden. On va regarder ça comme tout le monde, voir ce que les Américains vont choisir comme président demain.
Les Américaines?
Pour les Américaines, c'est une bonne question. Moi, je pense qu'il faut partout, puis je m'en suis jamais cachée, je pense que le droit à l'avortement et l'accès à l'avortement a été un enjeu de l'heure. C'est quand même assez étonnant qu'encore aujourd'hui, on ait à défendre le droit fondamental des femmes de choisir leur propre corps. Et ce que je vois au sud de la frontière, c'est que ça demeure un enjeu important. Et je comprends que ça va être aussi un enjeu pour nous ici au Canada, parce que la réalité, c'est que l'accès à l'avortement n'est pas égal partout. Et ça fait partie des enjeux importants pour les femmes.
Coucher tard ce soir pour regarder les résultats?
Demain, peut-être? Tu veux dire demain?
Demain
soir.
Oui.
Oui, je pense que comme tout le monde, les élections maintenant, on n'a pas les résultats le même soir. Donc, on se réveille peut-être même le lendemain sans le sachant des résultats. Fait qu'on va voir ça comme tout le monde le temps venu. C'est bon?
Bonjour tout le monde. Hi everybody. Just giving you an update on the Housing Accelerator Fund if you're interested. $175 million for Edmonton, $225 million for Calgary. Tens of thousands of homes are going to get built because of it. So, oui.
Quel est l'enjeu qui vous inquiète le plus ou sur lequel on devrait être le plus préoccupé par rapport aux élections américaines?
Ben, regarde, moi je vais attendre qu'on voit c'est qui gagne. Moi je sais qu'on a toujours bâti une équipe Canada qui est prête à répondre si c'est une administration démocrate ou républicaine. C'est exactement cela qu'on est en train de faire. On sait comment traiter les deux solitudes, si on peut le dire. Et moi je vais être aux aguets pour voir avec qui il faut transiger à partir de mardi.
Ah, vous trouvez que c'est deux solitudes?
Ben, regarde, je trouve que c'est deux différentes visions pour leur pays et c'est à nous de travailler avec quiconque les Américains décident de mettre en place.
Merci. I need to just ask you about Poilievre's letter to the premiers about canceling the Housing Accelerator Fund and cutting the GST. What do you think? It's
reckless. It's really bad. I mean, look, he earlier was talking about getting rid of gatekeepers. So what do? We went and said to the municipalities, speed up your zoning, get rid of red tape, and we'll give you more money to get houses built more quickly. It's happening. In Edmonton, we're 60% this year over housing starts from last year. We're on our way to doubling. I'll give you an example. In Edmonton, we have 6.5% of the housing starts. Right now, we're 2.5% of the population of the country. Why is that? Because of the Housing Accelerator Fund.
Can you outline what conditions the municipalities had to fulfill in order to get federal money from the Housing Accelerator Fund?
So I mentioned just a couple of them. There's another one. So we have a growing light rail transit system happening in Edmonton. One of the criteria was the closer you are to light rail transit, the more funding you'll get
for developers to be able to build high density there. Why? Because that's where students and workers want to live. They want to live along those transportation corridors. We see it in Toronto, we see it in Montreal, we see it in Vancouver. I want to see that in the prairies. People want to see that in Atlantic Canada. And so a combination of those different factors.
What do you make of the temple violence in Brampton?
Well, first of all, any type of violence, right, is deplorable. And I've always said anybody who commits an act of crime should be investigated by our police. And especially when it comes to religious places, right? It's a place of worship. People should be able to go back and forth freely. And anybody who violates that, I think Canadians would kind of see through that. But also, I think it's also very important for all Canadians to understand, especially at a time of significant foreign interference that's taking place, especially in our country, to be very mindful. They're that there could be susceptible for getting viewpoints going in different ways. And I want to remind also Canadians again, this is about the only two factors here is looking at organized crime, that's who we're targeting, and a hand of a foreign power, right? This is not about Canadians and communities, right? We all came here for a betterment of a future, and we don't want to allow any other foreign groups to be able to interfere with the, what we have here in Canada.
How do you reach out to, in your community, the Calistani side of the Sikh continuum is well known to you, I believe? Like, how do you?
When you say it's well known to me, right?
Well,
I should.
I'm sorry. Maybe
no, the reason why
can I just words, yeah. But what I'm saying is there is always a diversity within the Sikh continuum, as far as I understand. As a Christian asking about, there's we've heard tables and chairs over the years. We've heard Khalistan, not Khalistan. They are part of your constituency among others. How do you reach out to those folks as well as the BJP folks on the Hindu side and so on to try and keep?
So first of all, this is about BJP and other groups, and the reason I asked that is there's been actually a lot of false information, even just directly about me, and even just today, right? Me being called Khalistani, even a terrorist, and all those things. And I've been having to answer this question for almost my entire adult life, right? And I don't know what else I can say, how to prove myself otherwise, besides go through the scrutiny that I've gone through to become a police officer in the Vancouver Police, getting polygraphs, security clearance, and so forth, right? But when it comes to these things, I think as a former police officer, there are ways to be able to reach out to the various groups, and I believe our police forces either have, or some of them will be doing so, is to reach out to different groups that have those different links to be able to say, listen, if you have concerns, please say it either in a peaceful and calm way. And if there are different concerns, they're to do it through mediators like the police. But at the same time, we have to be mindful, and I believe our police are about from the foreign interference side. You can see, for the most part, everybody what they want is a safe and secure life for their families. When it comes to any type of criminality, whether the stuff that's being investigated by our police or any other acts of violence, it's really clear in our country. We have a criminal code that sets the rules, and our police should investigate regardless of which community it's coming from.
And forgive I was trying to go linguistically without triggering something. But I've got to segue to you, Mr., because Brampton West obviously is your home, but from the Vancouver South side to the Brampton West side, is there a way that you can reach out to the 5 or 6 ridings of Brampton and that in northern Mississauga as well?
Look, let me just first say, I think any form of violence or any acts of hate absolutely should be condemned, and we condemn them in the strongest forms possible, particularly the incidents that happened at a mandir yesterday, and as well as at a Sikh Gurdwara yesterday. And I think I've had a really good conversation with our local PO Police Chief Nish, who are investigating, who are looking into the folks involved. But it's really important, I will say, as community members, we spent an entire, the last few days celebrating Diwali and Bandi Chhod Divas in our Hindu temples, in our Gurdwaras, and we really saw that sense of community. And I think it's really important that we stand united as a community, that we stand united against any hatred and stand united against any form of people and and I will say, foreign interference that we see in our communities that actually try to destabilize this peace and unity that we have in our community. So I'll continue to do my part alongside my members of the community. My message is I think those, the values that we hold so close to our heart of unity, of compassion, and we're going to be celebrating Diwali on the Hill today, and you'll see beautiful community members from across, I know Brampton, that are here today as well. But it really is about bringing our communities together, and that's my message, and that's what we're going to continue to hone on.
My follow-up question is, Mr. Arya from the PN is well known as a strong voice of the Indo community. Is there a way that he should also join in? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, you are both from both observant Sikhs, so, and Mr. Arya is Hindu, so trying to get both sides of the voices together? Or? Absolutely. I mean, we're celebrating Diwali on the Hill. It's hosted by Liberal Caucus, and you have, Minister Anandasangaree, myself, Minister Anand, Minister Sajjan, and our entire caucus that is going to be there. We have a united voice. That's what makes Canada and our country so strong, our caucus so strong, because the Liberal Party of Canada is a party that we don't shy away from also, running away from tough conversations. We don't cancel events like Pierre Poilievre did or the Conservative Party did. We are actually with the community, and we're going to celebrate, and we're going to talk about and have tough conversations sometime. But it really is about bringing our, our voices together, because that's what ultimately Canada is all about.
And there are forces out there trying to divide our communities, and we're not going to allow that, right? And I think tonight's going to be a really good example of that.
I hope you come.
Thank you. Anything I missed? My questioning, we're all good there?
Okay.
Perfect.
No fireworks inside, right? Okay. Okay.
Not today.
Minister, as Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, got to ask you about the passing of Senator Sinclair. What are your thoughts, please?
I'm profoundly saddened by the loss of the late Senator Sinclair. He was an extraordinary lawyer, senator, chief commissioner, and justice of the Superior Court. He was deeply respected. He gave us a blueprint for reconciliation as chief commissioner, and he continued his advocacy right till the end. And one of my last meetings with him was in his capacity as a lawyer, and I'm deeply saddened for him, his family, and of course to all Canadians who are mourning his loss.
I've got to ask you, since Minister Sajjan and Minister Khera came down to speak about the temple violence, I mean, geographically you're a little ways away from that, but I'm sure it's a tenet within your side of the communities and so on. What do you make that as a Tamil? Because we had two Sikh ministers speaking about it.
My faith is I'm a Hindu. That's the faith that I practice, but I always feel that I am a Sikh, a Muslim, a Jew, Christian, and for me every place of worship is so important and it's sacred, and any attacks on any place of worship is an attack on all of us, and I'm really troubled by what's happened in Brampton and Surrey yesterday. There needs to be a de-escalation. There's no room for hate in this country. We need to all work together. Many of us came here from many parts of the world because we were fleeing violence or other forms of oppression, and Canada is a place for safety and security, and I believe that that all places of worship should be off limits. Today I ask everyone who's been involved to back off and to ensure that people have a right to practice their faith without interruption.
I just asked because both of us, I think, are now in our 50s since we're contemporaries. And
speak for yourself.
Well, sorry, I apologize. I'm not trying to rush you through it. But young men, and having been young men, are susceptible to coercion or to incitement or whatever. Is there a way you think that we can get through the social media and if there is foreign interference, and that causes people to show up and carry sticks into a parking lot of any religious establishment?
Look, I think what we've seen with social media overall, I think it's very harmful. We see that in elections, both in Canada and overseas. Social media does tend to bring the worst in us. But I want to really ask people who go to their place of worship to ensure that they reach out and they open their doors and they reach across differences and ensure that that everyone who is at their place of worship is not taught hatred or division. It's a place where people come together and unite. It doesn't matter what faith they are, unite as Canadians. And I think as the next few days and the next few weeks unravel, I think it's important that leaders speak out. I know I've noticed that there's been a number of statements that have come out condemning what happened last night. And I believe that all of us need to come together and condemn any form of violence anywhere, but particularly at place of worship.
Great, thanks, Michelle.